Test, test, test. Test. Test, test, test. Test, 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 test. Test, test, test.
Panel Beyond Carbon. I am very happy that I see some faces in the crowd because it's the only day that the Blue Zone is closed today, and that you guys made it indoors. You deserve an applause. So thank you for being here, and thank you to my fellow panelists as well for being here. I'm very excited about this discussion. My name is Hania Othman. I'm Director of Sustainable Impact, work with the HBAR Foundation, closely together with the team that you've probably met over here. And we have been talking about carbon up until this moment. So we're going to take it a little bit further and move beyond carbon and biodiversity and impact stewardship and what does that actually mean. But before we get started, I had a conversation with Simon, with Kane, with Bill, and Simon mentioned a quote that he just saw today on LinkedIn. So I wanted to kick off with that quote and ask my fellow panelists about their ideas on that. The quote being, "We no longer need a COP circus. Technology and markets are already solving the climate crisis." So with that being said, Simon, whilst introducing yourself and your work, could you also give us your thoughts on that topic?
Sure. Well, thanks to Herdera for the invitation to participate. My name is Simon Zadek. I'm the Executive Director of Nature Finance. It's a non-profit organization based in Switzerland and focused on multiple pathways for incorporating nature into financial market decisions, which in turn affect the real economy. Some of those are in the world that many of you inhabit that I know much less about, so tech and data and all of that stuff. Some of it is in the world of law, so how do anti-money laundering rules relate to the way financing happens that impacts nature crimes? You know, how does international processes work like the G20 in shaping trade rules and investment rules? So, you know, our take is there are multiple pathways for addressing the mission of ensuring that nature is counted in our global economy. What do I think of the quote? I think it is facile and dangerous. And why? Markets, according to the IPBES, are the principal driver of nature destruction and have been for the last 150 years. And so to argue that markets are the way to fix nature without reference to the rules that we construct to guide nature and guide markets, is an act of wanton vandalism. And so I would hope and assume that people in the room and elsewhere in this venue understand that we need a balance of market innovation and tech innovation and policy innovation. To your point just before we started, there are many ways in which we form policy and try to execute it that are no longer fit for purpose in the world in which we live in. So it isn't just that we need old-style policy with new-style tech. We need new ways of developing policy and governance models alongside new ways of thinking about market and tech and the role that tech plays in governance as well.
Thank you, Simon. Kane.
Thank you, Hania. Pleasure to be here, really delighted to be invited. So my name is Kane Blythe. I'm CEO of two companies. One is called Ecosoulis, and that was my original company. I'm an ecologist by background, despite the clobber, and I actually do get mistaken as a financier sometimes, which is a bit embarrassing, but understanding that I do need to speak the language of the financial markets and talk to people about how those sorts of places operate. Ecosoulis has been delivering nature-based solutions for over 30 years. So we create woodlands, we realign rivers, we create wetlands, reintroduce species. So we're coming at it from a very applied perspective. But a little while ago, back in 2013, I realized that the needle wasn't moving. So we needed to think about, from an organizational perspective, how can we, as a B Corp, think about how we can use our profits for purpose. And we started to imagine a future where nature was recognized within the markets. To answer that quote, the double materiality of nature is outside of the economy. It's regarded as a resource that can be extracted for product and services. The contribution to local communities, indigenous people, our well-being, the ecosystem services that we depend upon in terms of clean water, clean air, food, all of those things are not fully accounted for in the markets. So that's not possible, as Simon says, at this stage. The vandalism will continue. And so we created Credit Nature as a tool for monitoring ecosystem integrity and health, engaging with technology, which certainly does have a part, but you can't take people out of the process. And the idea with this technology is to monitor and track ecosystem integrity over time, convert that into metrics that the markets can recognize and engage with, and then provide access to different types of financial mechanisms. One of them would be biodiversity credits in this context. So that's how we're sort of looking and approaching these things.
Hi, everybody. Bill Kentrup. I'm a co-founder of a company called All Infra, a Hong Kong-based company, as well as co-founder of the Ethereum Climate Platform. And just to give a bit of my background, and then maybe you can guess what my response to the question will be. So I started my, life as an oceanographer, so more on the environmental science side of things, looking at nutrients and how that impacts growth in the oceans and ultimately CO2. So coming at things from an environmental standpoint. Past 25 years has been in environmental finance, mostly out in Asia Pacific, so 23 years in Hong Kong. Set up one of Asia's first environmental commodities businesses. We were investing very early in clean development mechanism, financing projects, getting new methodologies written, and the product to settle those contracts was emission reduction certificates. For 8 years, I ran Macquarie Bank's Asia Pacific environmental infrastructure and environmental financial products business. Again, carbon finance, renewable certificate, but also growth capital, debt, equity hybrids into projects. And then now my company, what we do is provide digital solutions that really, as I was describing before to my colleague here, our goal is to make institutional green finance 10% better. We're not trying to reinvent green finance. We're not trying to replace the way the market works. We're trying to take out the friction, trying to use tech to make the products more verifiable, easier to invest in, easier to trade, and ultimately easier to track and verify over time. So with all that, with that tech and finance background, I couldn't agree with your response more, which is it's definitely not the silver bullet to especially the natural capital side of the market. So whereas I think it's important and I think it improves things, for a long time, and I guess starting probably in around 2004, we looked at a lot of large-scale natural capital assets, and we invested in some of them, and over the years said no to a lot of them. And one of the issues with large landscape natural capital assets is they're one of the most poorly operationalized asset types in the market. And one of the issues is that when you have a government buyer or a government like a private public-private partnership on the buy side, and the local government decides, you know what, we need this land now for agroforestry, or we need this land for some other more important local part of the economy. It's one thing if a corporate buyer is trying to enforce on that contract. It's a very different thing if a large government that has other debt relationships or other much bigger consequential relationships with that country. So typically for us, very much see the role of the developer operator being in safe hands with corporates and with the commercial side of the market, with good incentives that incentivize people to develop and operate those projects in the long term. But on the buy side, especially when you're dealing with large landscapes that cover significant portions of countries, that government, whether it's policy that requires certain action or a commercial participation of a government to enforce when things go wrong, is an important layer to making natural capital work, in my view.
Thank you so much, Bill. I think at the moment we are obviously at a crossroads, and we have been looking at carbon as a vehicle, biodiversity credits as well. My question, and obviously the question of this entire COP, moving from COP27 to COP28, is often revolving around the need for financing. And Simon, you just mentioned the fact that we need better rules, potentially, and we need better ways in order to get to those rules, in order to define it. But I wanted to link back to you, Bill, in order to kick off this conversation. Financing is often being placed in the middle or almost at the front of the solution that we need. But even if we have financing, let's say for biodiversity, to mitigate biodiversity loss, how do we even implement that? And what are the rules around that? And how do you view that from your perspective as an overall solution, which is not clearly defined?
Sure. So maybe one way to approach that is that, let's assume you have the right host country buy-in and a partner in say a buy-side country with a private buyer involved. So you've got the right kind of credit on both sides of the trade. Then you have the reality of operating a project. And one of the issues with large landscape natural capital assets has been that the carbon price goes up and down. And when the carbon price softens, you don't have this standing stock of developers that have boots on the ground in all these remote areas that have another business that keeps the lights on. And so carbon price goes up, you have this big rush of developers that are able to get their hands on the local rights to develop a project. They may be able to get the project approved by a standard. They may be able to get it so far as entering into an offtake agreement. but many cases where when the market price softens, maybe their emission reduction purchase agreement falls away because often projects are late in delivery, which triggers cancellation rights of the contract. Suddenly there's no value, commercial value, to keep the lights on, to keep people employed and to run the project. So one of the things that we've been doing over the past 4 years is looking for operators that are inherently on the ground in these remote areas with all of the back office function of hiring people, training people, enforcing contracts, and so forth. And so an example of that is we work quite a bit with renewable energy developers. And if you look at that, the history of renewables, they've been increasingly getting out into these remote areas with boots on the ground, with government relationships, hiring people, training people, making sure people are incentivized, sharing with the local community. And often it's an obligation, a cost and an obligation for them to do tree studies, do biodiversity studies as part of their power purchase agreement or their feed-in tariff. And so what we've been doing is working quite a bit with developers significantly in Asia Pacific to teach them a little bit about how the natural capital carbon market works, how biodiversity co-benefits work. And we've had some really good success in having those players expand the remit of their business from just being renewables to custodians of the land on a much larger area. And so that's become both a kind of revenue driver for many of these players, but from my perspective as an investor, a significant de-risking factor for these assets over a 10, 20-year crediting period, because each of these players have tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars of CapEx on the ground there that they have to protect. So if the carbon price for natural capital assets softens, they've got to be there, and they've got to keep operating that project, and they typically have to do it anyway as part of their obligations for their renewable assets. So that's just an example of, when I look at those sort of projects from an investment perspective, I struggle, especially in large projects, to get comfortable with the credit or the operational risk if it's just a natural capital asset. But if it's a natural capital asset that has, some other, commercial incentive to keep someone there for 10, 20, 30 years, other than the carbon price, then from a risk perspective, I get a bit more comfortable.
Thank you for sharing that. Kane, you have two companies. One of them is a project, you have acted as a project developer, and with Credit Nature, you're currently pioneering within designing frameworks for bio credits or nature credits. Hearing Bill speaking obviously about his experience from a carbon market perspective, how would you tie that back into the work that you're doing in regards to biodiversity credits and also the market that you're trying to appeal to in terms of investors?
Yeah, I think from the perspective of biodiversity credits, one of the really key elements here is that the credit itself we see as de-risked by involving the custodians of the land in whatever form, because where we're looking at complex systems, where we're looking at restoration of processes and functions, we need those land managers, those local communities, indigenous people to be able to deliver the outcomes that we are designing into the credit itself. And by doing that, we're able to then ensure that there's some form of embedded permanence in those units. And that's a really critical aspect, because biodiversity credits that aren't supported by the local community, we would argue don't have that form of embedded permanence. And so the way we deal with that, again, is instead of coming in and saying, well, we know better and we'll tell you how to do it because we can maximize the number of credits we could generate by doing it this way, we actually start at first principles and say, from a design perspective and a delivery perspective, what outcomes can we achieve that will result in the ability of those communities to generate forms of revenue themselves that's above and beyond the credit. So projects that we're working on have a wide range of activities, from regenerative pastoralism, farming, through release of carbon assets as well, through forestry creation, reintroduction of species that attract ecotourism opportunities, green product. So we're thinking about it in quite a holistic way to ensure that, coming back to the points Bill makes, that there's always a sustainable nature-based economy available for those communities to deliver on.
Thank you, Kane. Simon, with the Task Force for Nature Markets, you've done a tremendous amount of work with all of the working groups, and mostly in terms of understanding how to design markets better, governance of it, biocredit markets, but overall looking at nature markets more than just the carbon markets, more than just the biocredit markets. Could you tell us a little bit more about your perspective regarding market design, regarding governance, and regarding biocredit markets?
Yeah, so actually it's great having Bill and Kane here because they're actually doing stuff on the ground, so I can just pontificate endlessly. So, you know, for those who need a way of thinking about nature, if you focused on primarily carbon so far, think 100% of the global economy is 100% dependent on nature. And if you start there, yeah, then actually biocredits is interesting today, irrelevant, may be relevant in the future, but there are much bigger games already at play where your work may be relevant. What's the world's largest nature market? Well, it's soft commodities. You know, we've got $4.5 trillion worth of food and forest being traded, and it is arguably beyond the mafia and armaments, the most untransparent market on the planet. There are 6 companies, 5 private unlisted, 1 Chinese state-owned, highly integrated vertically and horizontally, and actually we have no idea how they work. And they're so powerful that, coming back to that earlier quote, there is barely a country on the planet that will even attempt to regulate them. So Switzerland, for example, Geneva is one of the world's largest commodity trading venues. There is no commodities regulator in Switzerland. Why? Because the day anybody says the word regulator in Bern, it'll be in Dubai. And so, yes, let's talk about biocredits. And I'm happy to do that because I'm doing lots of work on it, and it's great that we've got 2 practitioners on the table. But there's a much bigger game in play where the work that you do and the capabilities that you have can play itself out effectively. Comment on the specifics then, just to sort of bring it back. So in the biocredit space, there is, as there was for the carbon market, the voluntary carbon market space, if I can be more specific, an international initiative trying to figure out how to develop the right kinds of standards and rules and principles to govern international, quote-unquote, biodiversity credit marks going forward. Now, in the last round, which was the Task Force on Scaling Voluntary Carbon Markets, the entire way of thinking about it was really quite simple. They're like financial markets. Liquidity and price discovery is most important. It's basically a commodity, so you've got to minimize any other possible trading rules, pretend that top-down private certification might work, and away we go. And guess what? It didn't work. Yeah, I mean, it wouldn't really have taken a genius to work that out in advance. Yeah, and actually, lots of people knew it wasn't going to work, but already incumbent interests with a dominant financial interest were at the core of the process. And so now we have the International Integrity Council on Voluntary Carbon Markets desperately trying to retrofit a smarter set of rules into the way voluntary carbon markets work. And as one of them said to me last night, very late in a taxi on the way home, Simon, frankly, I don't think that's probably possible. Yeah, kind of read my lips. So the biocredit markets is interesting because we have another opportunity, but to think differently about how that might work. Do we even want secondary markets? Yeah, is this going to really contribute to actual impact on the ground or value to indigenous people and local communities that are stewarding that nature? Maybe we do, maybe we don't, but let's not assume that liquidity is the game in town for what are effectively public purpose markets that work through private gain principles. Let's think about it. Do we want commodity type markets where every ton is the same? Or do we want branded markets? Do we want the Pata-Surawiya tribe in northwest Brazil, Amazon, to have their own credit that you may trust or you may not trust? Which means, yes, you may still have a technical version of analytic oversight and verification, but you have a different type of trust flowing through the system that has to do with where it came from and who actually stewards that nature. So my ask to you, sorry, I'll bring to a close, is let's kind of think differently about the way in which biocredit markets might evolve. Stop thinking carbon, not only because it really hasn't worked, but also because that's not what biodiversity is about, and that's not how local communities function. We have the opportunity to develop a sophisticated, more nuanced set of distributed markets, not necessarily a global market at all, where the interests and the persona, in many ways, of nature's stewards are present in those markets going forward, and they can still profit traders going forward. So it isn't a philanthropic space that only works with grant money. I think the place of technology and the place of data is absolutely critical in that, but it requires you as a community to have some fun in innovating in a very, very different type of market space. Thank you.
Yes, please.
Just to add something to that, you know, the biodiversity side, and I guess the broader kind of category of co-benefits has always been, or has long been, a feature of the carbon market. And so I guess, you know, early on it was this emergence of the concept of co-benefits. So the product was carbon, and then for some projects you have these additional benefits. Let's describe them, let's market them, let's see if we can get a price premium. And then, you know, then you have some initiatives that try to productize that in some way. You know, now let's have those, that biodiversity and other community benefits meet certain standards so you can kind of crystallize value, or at least have a better negotiation to put a price on that. And I guess, you know, what you're saying is, or, you know, and part of that discussion is, do you then want that to become then its own standalone product? For example, a biodiversity credit that has its own characteristics, that has its own price. One of the challenges with that, and speaking with Sarah earlier from Gold Standard, is that, you know, there's always been a debate of, you know, you've got, in essence, some benefit having co-benefits that ride along with carbon. You know, there's Paris Agreement, 197 countries setting targets, voluntary action, a lot of carbon investment that needs to be done, and having those co-benefits as a component of that maybe has the benefit of it comes along for the ride. If you separate it out as a product, you then may quickly discover whether the biodiversity benefits are worth 50 cents to someone or $5, and you know, so that's also, I guess, a risk and a challenge. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, but there are definitely pros and cons in terms of when you think about that, crystallizing that benefit. Is it better to have it as a kind of aggregate product like a carbon credit with co-benefits, or is the goal to tease that out so you eventually have a standalone product that you can even use as collateral for, you know, for your financing?
Can I cheat? Yeah, as long as it's transparent, right? You know, so yes, and yeah, that actually we don't need a unitary commodity style market. Yeah, we can have carbon credits with bioenhancement. We can have biodiversity insets that are about resource productivity. Nestle, you know, investing down its value chain in soil productivity enhancement. We can have offsets that are internationally traded if we can figure out biome equivalence. We can have offsets that are localized, net loss gain models sitting within countries like Colombia, Australia, and elsewhere. So actually, if we kind of open the box and we don't think about carbon markets, and we don't think how can we make biodiversity credit markets as much like carbon markets as possible, actually I think we'll come up with a very different and heterogeneous way of thinking about how biodiversity can be financialized in productive ways through market innovation.
Thanks, Simon. I was just going to come in on that one because there is a there's quite a fundamental mindset difference between the carbon markets and the emerging biodiversity and ecosystem markets. And from the perspective of what Simon was saying earlier, we're 100% dependent on nature. The global GDP is 100% dependent on nature. And so if we want to think of it from a market perspective, it's the infrastructure. Nature is the infrastructure upon which we depend. And we need to understand that there's a difference between the house and the home that we're associated with. So when we want to invest in nature, we believe that you need to secure the asset, you need to regard ecosystems as infrastructure, invest in the function and the processes of that infrastructure, and that carbon is a co-benefit of that. So there is a complete topsy-turvy mind shift. In addition to that, the co-benefits of ecosystem services that we get, such as clean water, clean air, these are all byproducts. Even biodiversity emergence are byproducts of securing the asset and ensuring that the asset can function. So when we as an organization think about what are we measuring and why, what questions we're asking, we want to measure ecosystem integrity, because the integrity of the ecosystem is our clearest beacon of light to know which direction to travel in. And if we're in a low state, we know that we need to move up. If we're in a high state, then we need to know that we can protect that resource. But we're not clever enough to try and second guess what nature's going to do under all of these different scenarios. So we have to also allow nature to do its thing without us farming every aspect of it, from carbon through to water to other aspects. So it's a bit more nuanced, unfortunately, but thinking of it as real estate, infrastructure, ecosystem as infrastructure is quite a useful analogy from my perspective.
Continuing on this subject, Kane, as a standard developer, from your point of view, practically, what progress has realistically been made in order to develop standards for biodiversity credits, and where do you feel like it's still lacking?
So just quickly, we're not a standard developer, so we've developed a framework around which is made up of different dimensions of ecosystem integrity, measuring the ability of species to disperse, for example, the presence of functional species that are strong indicators of food web complexity, the heterogeneity of landscapes, and also the presence of niche and occupancy of niche. So under the surface of our 0 to 100 score in our system is that sort of complexity. But we're working with standards agencies like Accounting for Nature. Now, we've purposely selected Accounting for Nature because they've been doing this for 15 years, and they've approved 21 different types of ecosystem unit. And this methodology is assessed by 96 scientists around the world. They have tested it on 8 million hectares. So as a standard, there's only one game in town from our perspective. Now, going back to the different types of credits for different purposes, I think there will be new standards that develop that will be recognized or will recognize these different methodologies. But I think this is important because obviously the units and the credits need to measure impact. This isn't about assessing the methodology. This isn't about assessing how clever everyone is in building those methodologies. It's about measuring the impact of the units and the credits that are investing in nature and communities. So if it's not an impact standard, then again, it's not measuring the outcome that we all need as a society to flourish. So that's why we're working for Accounting for Nature. And then going sort of one step further, the reason we've built a technological platform working on a Microsoft accelerator, looking at distributed ledger technologies, is to ensure that there is independent verification and validation of all of those data points that are meaningful in the establishment of that, or evidencing the outcome of that method and the delivery of those units. So it's kind of trying to bring all the standards and technology together to get the best outcome.
So bringing it back to your favorite subject, Simon, technology. Hearing Kane speaking about independent verification and validation and verification, utilizing technology for that, putting technology potentially as a center point, how do you feel about that? And how do you feel like technology might be beneficial and might not be beneficial?
Right. It's like sort of throwing me to the wolves with these folks, isn't it, a bit? So let's start at the beginning. Yeah, notwithstanding our good friends, if they're here from Gold Standard and Vera, top-down certification models as primary regulatory functions in any market can only fail. And there are decades and decades of experience of that. And so if anything's gone wrong with Vera and Gold Standard verification models, you know, frankly, they should get a free pass, because really there are much broader regulatory challenges at stake. So that would be the first thing. You know, you can buy an ISO 14000 standard on any street corner in Mumbai for $500. You know, just understand that certification has a subsidiary role in any kind of process of this kind. And then we can put it to good use because it has limited application. Yeah, but if we privilege it as being a primary regulatory function, it will let us down consistently. Yeah, so that's the first thing, and that's not a technology comment, but it is should we say, a passing remark. Secondly, as we begin to see the Integrity Council for Scaling Voluntary Carbon Markets trying to rebuild the trust of carbon markets, one, albeit slightly brutal and unfair way of thinking about it, is that they are creating barriers to entry into voluntary carbon markets to protect those that are inside the wall, and that will disadvantage many actors from the global south trying to begin to develop what in the first instance may be quite low quality credits. And that's true in the biocredit space, and it's true in the carbon space. Technology has a critical role to play in taking down those walls and enabling low quality credits to enter the market, because actually the irony is that's what we need. Yeah, we need more and more actors to kind of get into the process, recognizing that they may be low quality to begin with, and we need real-time data flows that are able, particularly ones linked to nature-based assets, to be able to calibrate what the quality of those carbon credits are or biocredits are, and to price them effectively in markets. That then will incentivize an improvement of those project developers in the underlying assets, and that will improve the pricing of those products. If we have the right kind of contracts that incentivize those actors not to sell just long-term offtakes, but to benefit from the improvement in the quality of those underlying assets, you know, then we're into what could be a virtuous circle, and that clearly requires technology. There's no doubt about that. And analog policy walls that try to protect high-quality integrity markets are actually going to become part of the problem, part of the constraint. So there, I think, there's a really kind of interesting piece in play that we need to work with. And then finally, coming back to my toothpaste model, you know, which is why can't we have, you know, an indigenous community trademarking or branding their own credit? If we think about that as a form of governance, it gets quite interesting. So, you know, 2 days ago we had a session here with a group of indigenous leaders talking about biocredit markets, and one of the principal issues they put on the table is, how does it work if the entire issue of trust is removed from us into a technocratic MRV-based oversight mechanism? Where do we sit in that process beyond supplying product? Yeah, and part of the conversation that emerged in that was that if really what that verification is about is to build trust, then why wouldn't there or couldn't there be an aspect of trust that has to do with the origination of the credit in the first place? You know, if that credit comes from Bill, and as I'm sure everybody would agree, he is an incredibly trustworthy person, yeah, then although there might in addition be a technocratic MRV process, you know, shortfalls that are temporary that we observe in the market, we wouldn't necessarily penalize because we think Bill's a really good guy. Yeah, and so that actually has real meaning in international markets. Think of anyone that walks into a bar, you know, in a favela in Brazil, and they can either buy an unbranded Sprite or they can buy a Coca-Cola. Well, the Coca-Cola is going to kill you, but you buy it. Why do you buy it? Because you trust it. Yeah, and so actually it's really horrible and it's full of rubbish, and we all know that, but we buy it because we don't really know what the other one is. So that's an aspect where trust building isn't just a function of a technology play, although there may be technology enablers that help to project that community integrity into the way in which markets work going forward. So I think it's that balance, again, that we've been talking about all the way along.
Just very briefly, we're doing exactly that in Scotland, for example, where a community of actors, NGOs, landowners, communities are looking at creating a collection. So we're using sort of semi-fungible tokens, blockchain-based tokens, to connect to those communities, and we're creating and looking at designing what's called a Riverwoods collection, for example, which is characteristic of the Scotland the Big Picture NGO, which is very much around rewilding-based practices, but that's effectively going to be a branded collection of tokens, and then we're looking at different collections, the drill burn collection, for example, in different areas. So exactly that kind of idea. Yeah.
Really? Oh, we just got started.
Let me tell a story.
Yeah.
Just kidding.
I think I just want to ask one little question to Bill, because I think, Bill, just talking about de-risking and de-risking of at project level in a very short way.
Okay, very quickly. So just take digital MRV, data collection from the asset, including devices, soil sensors, IoT, satellites, but also ground truth data that gets stored on chain. You know, this is our business. Now, perfect world, the standards take that data for the purpose of creating the instrument. But just very quickly, even if that never happens, and it's starting to happen, they're piloting it, from someone who's an investor in those projects, and we had anywhere from 30, sometimes 70, 80 projects on the books in 15 different countries. Those projects deliver with high variability. I have back-to-back contracts, or if I'm a compliance buyer, I have reconciliation periods where I face penalties. Projects are short, they're late all the time. So even just having that data feed that gives me a 90% probability of what's likely to come at the end of the year, instead of waiting for a long, opaque verification process to give me an answer at the end of the year, that allows me to then enter into forward additional agreements if I need to fill a shortfall. So the digital and the insight that gives you on an ongoing basis from a financial value and an option value perspective is much more significant than the cost savings of taking manual to digital. That visibility has huge financial value.
Thank you so much. So I feel like we just got started, and I was just getting into this conversation. I want to thank you all. Thank you so much for this brief but obviously very interesting conversation. Hope we can continue it. And I'm sorry, we don't have any time for questions. But yeah, thanks.
We're going to get started with the next panel at 30 after. So now we're going to take a quick break. And we'll be back at 30 after if everyone could be in their seats, and we'll get started on the Discovering a Global Climate Asset Price panel. Thank you.
Hey guys, I'm Gal.